You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Disney's Lilo & Stitch has finally landed on Disney+. Now you can watch the global phenomenon at home with your Ohana.
Be good for 1 second.
Lilo & Stitch is verified hot on Rotten Tomatoes with an audience score of 93%.
Perfect.
Stitch is also cute and fluffy.
Disney's Lilo & Stitch, rated PG, now streaming on Disney+. And right now, you can get Disney+, Hulu, and all of ESPN with an incredible limited-time offer. Terms apply.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Komm du Nosk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 242, North Africa 1940, part 6, Bardia. This week, a big thank you goes out to Edward and Keith for the donations on Ko-Fi, and to Pilgrim for supporting the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out about becoming a member or to find out about one-time donation options. Thank you, as always, to everyone who has chosen to support the podcast in whatever way they wish to. Operation Compass, Britain's first major offensive effort in North Africa in late 1940, had gone extremely well. What had originally been pitched as a raid with a relatively focused set of objectives had been expanded in scope due to the relatively quick and easy capture of the Italian fortified camps near Sidi Barrani, and then Sidi Barrani itself. The Italians, after the collapse of their prepared defensive positions, would be forced to retreat all along the front as their units tried to make their way westward towards the border before being cut off by British forces that were, well, trying to cut them off. The next two episodes of the podcast will cover these efforts, the Italians to retreat and the British to prevent that from happening. This episode will discuss the advance up to and into the attack on Bardia, an important town along the coast where the Italians had set up some serious defenses that the British forces would have to work through. The next episode will discuss the continuation of the British advance further to the west, past Tobruk and Benghazi, and all the way to Beda Fomm. But first, we have to start with why an attack that started with modest goals expanded to an operation that would involve the British advancing hundreds of kilometers. When Operation Compass was originally proposed, the plan was relatively simple. The fortified camps around Sidi Barrani would be assaulted, perhaps captured, and then Sidi Barrani would also be attacked. However, it was always envisioned as a raid, not an offensive to take territory, and that meant that the plan was to withdraw all British forces back to their starting lines as soon as the Italian positions were neutralized. There were two primary reasons for this plan being so limited in ambition. The first was simply supplies. Everything in the Western Desert revolved around supplies, and Compass was no different. Supplies had been pushed forward for the initial attacks into field supply depots that were as close to the fighting as possible. But by the time the fighting ended at Sidi Barrani, these depots had been heavily depleted and only had a few days of supplies left. Getting more supplies to the depots would be challenging, and if the British continued their advance, this would make supporting the attacking units even more difficult. The second reason for Compass's limited goals were the demands of other theaters. The 4th Indian Division, which had played such a pivotal role in the attacks on the Italian camps, was scheduled to be moved to Sudan to take part in an upcoming attack against the Italian positions in East Africa. This would drastically reduce the fighting power of the British forces available in the Western Desert. The orders would begin to arrive for the withdrawal of the 4th Indian Division on December 11th, which came as quite a shock to the commander of the division, who had somehow not been informed of his division's pending transfer. He would write of the order that, quote, "It was a tremendous shock. I had had no previous intimation of it, and it came to me as a bolt from the blue," end quote. With the departure of the 4th Indian Division, the 7th Armored Division would be essentially attacking by itself, although the 6th Australian Division was moving forward to bolster the British armor and to take part in the next series of advances. While there were reasons to stick to the original plan, as just discussed, there were also many reasons to continue the attack. The first was that the Italians had been shattered, and it appeared that there was no real Italian resistance in front of the British troops. In theory, given the limited transportation routes available to the Italians, there was a possibility that their units could be cut off and surrounded and perhaps destroyed. And if that could happen, the risk of overextending the British forces would be more than worth it. This would come with sacrifices from the men at the front, though, as there would need to be considerations made for the very limited ability to move supplies to the front, meaning trade-offs would have to be made. The British forces could pursue the Italians, and they would, but they would do so only by accepting a bit of hunger and thirst, as the transport capacity was shifted to the more pressing needs of petrol and ammunition. One thing that could not easily be solved by reallocating transport capacity was the issue of mechanical breakdowns among British tanks and other vehicles. This would cause far greater damage to the ability of British units to continue forward than anything that the Italians would be capable of. For example, the 7th Armored Brigade of the 7th Armored Division had mostly avoided the heavy fighting during the opening days of the attack, making it one of the fresher units that was available for the pursuit. But even with that being the case, one of its armored units had started the operation with 50 tanks, and it was down to 25 as the push for Bardia began. And this type of mechanical attrition would occur in essentially every type of motor vehicle used, although some types, like tanks, would have greater issues. The good news was that similar issues were being experienced by the Italians, and they did not have the always beneficial feeling that they were winning, that they were losing, and they knew it. As far as the British troops were concerned, they were on a triumphant victory march. All they had to do was keep going forward, and that is a tremendous motivating factor during an advance like what would happen here towards Bardia. Unfortunately, things would not go exactly to plan for the British advance, and they would be unable to cut off the Italians as they retreated towards Bardia. Bardia had been selected as the objective of the British advance due to the fact that it was the first major Italian port along the coast, after Sidi Barrani, which had already been captured. It was also the only port in this part of Libya, other than Tobruk, which was much further to the west, that could support the large supply ships that the British would need to be able to extend their advances further west. But of course, Bardia was important to the Italians for roughly the exact same reasons. Also as an area where supplies could be delivered, assuming the Royal Navy was not wandering about. This meant that Italian forces moved into prepared defenses at Bardia and bolstered its defenses before the arrival of the British troops. These defenses were far from trivial, with the port being seen by the Italians as a critical area for them to retain control over, resulting in work being done over the preceding months, just in case something like exactly what was happening would happen. The perimeter was about 29 kilometers in length, or 18 miles, and it included a barbed wire fence that ran the entire length, along with a 4-foot deep and 12-foot wide anti-tank ditch. Infantry and artillery positions had then been placed behind these defenses, most of which were contained within concrete-lined trenches and shelters. Then behind these were a series of minefields before yet another line of defenses. There were also about 400 artillery guns arranged to protect the defenses, and the Italian artillery had up until this point been one of the bright spots for the Italians when fighting the British, and so their skill and abilities would be crucial to the performance of the defense. The commander of the Italian garrison at Bardia, Lieutenant General Bergonzoli, was apparently given the nickname Electric Whiskers by the British, due to the fact that he had a bright red beard, which does not impact anything about the events that are about to take place. I just think it's a fun mental image to have this Italian general with a bright red beard. Many of the Italian troops that made their way to Bardia had previously been the garrisons of some of the Italian fortified camps that had not been attacked by the British, and therefore they were already trained and equipped to take part in exactly the kind of defensive action that was going to occur at Bardia. But one of the major issues that Bardia would have as a defensive bastion was that only about a month of water was available. Another major issue they would have was less physical and more mental and psychological. Even though the defenses at Bardia were strong, and even though they had around 45,000 troops and hundreds of artillery pieces, there was still the problem of confidence. After the complete disasters that had occurred around Sidi Barrani, some of the troops that had made it to Bardia had participated in that fighting. They had seen the advances of the British forces firsthand, and it would be this issue that would play a major role in the fighting in the days and weeks that followed the British arrival at Bardia. A simple lack of belief among several of the Italian soldiers that they could defeat the British, that they could hold out, that there was any hope in the defense. During the advance to Bardia, the British would actually cross over the border between Egypt and Libya, with Bardia being about 25 kilometers or 15 miles on the Libyan side of that border. This meant that along the way, they did push all of the enemy forces out of Egypt, at least along the coast, which was a propaganda victory, if not necessarily one that was very important on the ground. As was often the case during the North African War for its entire duration, some of the British forces actually powered their push to Bardia with supplies captured from the Italian camps that they had captured over the previous days. The infantry units, in particular, did well in their requisitioning efforts from the Italian supplies. However, many of these supplies might have helped the British troops get to Bardia, but it wouldn't necessarily help them attack the Italian positions. So when they arrived outside of Bardia, some initial reconnaissance would take place, just to try and understand the general layout and strengths and weaknesses of the Italian defenses. As with any series of defenses on the scale of Bardia, they were not uniform, and there were some areas that were stronger or weaker, not due to any mistakes made by the Italians, but simply due to geography. The Italians were planning based on the idea that the most likely avenue for attack was from the southeast, which would roughly be the direction that the British would approach from. But the British had different ideas when it came to an actual assault. They would instead use their reconnaissance patrols to find weak points within the Italian defenses where their success was the most likely. As the plan was developed and refined, one of the most important questions that had to be answered was how quickly the British forces could neutralize the effects of the anti-tank ditches that the Italians had built to keep out the British tanks. Obviously, any ditch can be handled by the simple act of filling it back in, although it's not always quite that easy. In this case, to try and figure out how long it would take, test ditches were dug back away from Bardia so that the Australian infantry that had arrived could test its abilities and speed at filling it in and preparing it for the tanks and other vehicles to cross. This information was critical for the British to understand because the time it took to fill the ditch was exactly how long they would have to protect the infantry and engineers that would be in the danger zone around the ditch, frantically trying to fill it back in, because obviously the Italians would try to prevent this from happening. While these tests were being done and other preparations were being made, the Royal Navy would also get involved in the fighting at Bardia. The HMS Terror, a monitor with 15-inch guns, would shell the port, while gunboats would attack the facilities as well. In one instance, with the Aphis, a gunboat, just sort of hanging out in Bardia harbor for an hour while shooting up various shore facilities and small Italian vessels. But small actions by small naval vessels would never destroy the Bardia defenses entirely, and eventually it would all come down to an assault.
And now, a message from McAfee.
Your package couldn't be delivered.
You owe thousands in unpaid tolls!
You want a free gift?
If texts like these sound familiar, McAfee can help. McAfee automatically identifies text and email scams as well as AI-generated audio to help you stay safe. If they're faking it, they're not making it past us. Get award-winning scam detection today. McAfee.com/keepitreal.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
The British ground forces arrived outside Bardia during the second week of December, although they would not actually launch their attack until after the new year. There were many reasons for this, the simplest being that supplies and forces had to be assembled outside Bardia for the effort to take place. This included the Matilda tanks, which would play an important role in the final assault. Due to their speed, reliability, and their rate of consumption of fuel and water, they took longer to arrive than some other assets, but they would be there in time. There was no way to bring the British units up to full establishment, though, as there was simply too much attrition that had been experienced getting to Bardia. This meant that armored units in particular were well below half strength in the days before the attack, which was due strictly to the lack of endurance on the part of British tanks. Even in the best of conditions, without Italian resistance, many tanks were not able to make the trip from British bases in the east all the way to Bardia, and this made it difficult to build units back up to full strength. The terrain in this area made things even worse, with the rocky nature of that terrain causing all kinds of issues with tracks and suspension systems, which were frequently the reason that a tank would be put out of action. The track pins on the British cruiser tanks deserve special mention for being completely inadequate for the task that was being asked of them. What was closer to full strength was the Australian 6th Division, and it would be the primary unit used in the attack, and the attack would succeed or fail based on the abilities, courage, and actions of the Australians. As the British plan developed, the decision was made to not attack from the obvious direction, the southeast, and instead to make the main British effort from the west. A diversionary effort would still be made from the south just to distract the Italians from the main effort that was again going to come from the west. In that main attack would be the Matildas of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, along with supporting infantry and engineers. The engineers played perhaps the most critical role in the entire attack because it was on their shoulders to fill the anti-tank ditches as quickly as possible so that the tanks could roll through at several different points along the front. Getting them across in multiple different areas was critical to ensuring that they could not be countered by artillery or they would not be stopped and delayed by a single vehicle setting off a mine, which was always a possibility. After the initial attacks, other forces were positioned to follow in from the west, and then once they penetrated into the camp, a larger set of forces would then also attack from the southeast, with the goal of trying to trap a significant portion of the Italian defenders on the southern side of the Bardia defenses. In all of their planning, the British always had to keep in mind that they were actually quite outnumbered by the Italian defenders, with the ratio being somewhere around 2-1 in favor of the Italians. One minor administrative note here, on January 1st, 1941, the collection of units outside of Bardia, which had previously been given the name the Western Desert Force, was renamed to the 13th Corps. I bring this up in case you end up doing some of your own reading on this topic, as the changing of names on January 1st, 1941 can cause some havoc on maps and sources that kind of track the actions that are happening at this time. So just keep this rename sort of in the back of your head should you want to go deeper into the story. The attack would begin on January 3rd with a 25-minute bombardment. As with every attack, most of the units involved were already in their starting positions. They'd been on the move for hours before the official start time of 6:40 a.m. An hour before that time, the engineers of the 6th Australian Division had moved forward and began cutting and destroying the Italian wire so that the 1st Battalion of troops could rush forward as quickly as possible when the time came. They were to get across the anti-tank ditch and establish a kind of perimeter on the other side so that the rest of the engineers could frantically begin filling the ditch to allow the tanks to move in. This they completed in less than an hour, and the tanks started moving towards the Italian defenses, working together with the Australian infantry to neutralize and destroy the Italian defenses. In terms of resistance, it was a mixed bag. Some of the Italian units quickly surrendered, basically giving up the fight as soon as the Italian infantry moved into the area. However, in other areas, the defenders resisted fiercely. This meant that some Australian units suffered heavy casualties, while for others, the biggest problem was what to do with all of the Italian prisoners that they suddenly had to deal with. Those Italian strongpoints that did persist in their resistance would still only delay the outcome by a few hours, and by the end of the first day of the attack, almost 2/3 of the Italian perimeter had been captured. When the offensive restarted the next morning on January 4th, the advances would continue, and by the middle of the afternoon the fighting was basically finished. One of the notable outcomes of the Battle of Bardia was the volume of weapons and supplies that were captured, including over 200 pieces of artillery and over 200 anti-aircraft guns. There would also be around 700 Italian trucks that were captured, which were quickly requisitioned by the British units, who had an insatiable appetite for transport vehicles of almost any kind. Almost the entirety of the Italian garrison would be captured, around 40,000 in total, and remarkably, the casualty totals for the British were very low, only around 130 men killed and 325 wounded. Capturing the Italian position so quickly was an impressive feat for the Australians, in what was really their first taste of battle. The quick success at Bardia would also allow for further advances to be ordered. This time, the British leaders were looking even further to the west. The most important target for the next series of advances was Tobruk, an important port that would allow the British to move their base of supply up from areas further to the east over all the way to Tobruk, which would save hundreds of kilometers of required ground transport at a time when it was basically impossible to move the volume of supplies required to the forward units. The 700 Italian trucks that were captured was nice, but attrition among transport vehicles would still cause many problems in the days and weeks that followed the Battle of Bardia. By the end of the year, somewhere around 40% of the trucks that the British used before the attacks on Sidi Barrani had been written off as lost due to mechanical issues. The biggest issues were sand and dust, which required constant cleaning of filters and ended up getting into every moving part, which greatly increased the general wear and tear on all of those parts. But it was not just the equipment that was wearing out, it was the men as well. For the men at the front of the advance, the exhaustion was really starting to show. This was true for any of the units involved, with some of them having advanced 200 miles in a month of constant frontline and combat conditions. Vehicle crews were sometimes even worse off than the infantry in terms of exhaustion because they also had to deal with the maintenance needs of their vehicles. This was particularly a problem for tank crews, who were largely in a situation where they were moving and fighting every day, while also having to try and find some time at night to do maintenance and repairs. But this was always interrupted by refueling, resupply, and random enemy actions, with the result that maintenance was deferred, even though it was an essential part of keeping the vehicles going. And while there were breakdowns of men and machines, the British did keep moving west, and while they were not able to capture Tobruk without a fight, when they did, they would capture an additional 27,000 Italian prisoners. This brought the total captured up to over 100,000 since the start of Operation Compass, which actually caused some real issues. Obviously, capturing over 100,000 enemy soldiers is never a bad thing in and of itself, but there were problems with supplying those prisoners. The end goal was always to get them moved back towards Alexandria and then further afield afterwards, but it was difficult to find transport to move them the 250 miles back to the east. Due to a lack of transport, many would be forced to make the trip on foot. But this could only be done in groups that could be controlled, and the British were dealing with a number of prisoners about 3 times greater than their total strength. The end result of these issues was the creation of various camps in some of the towns that had been captured, with the one at Tobruk packing 20,000 Italians into a space of only about 32 football fields. The conditions within the camp were absolutely miserable, with men packed in, and the weather, and the general lack of supplies. It was honestly challenging to keep the conditions livable. The only good news is that the numbers would begin to drop over time as more and more men were moved east. Unfortunately, it would be a long time before the slow trickle of Italian prisoners stopped arriving in Tobruk, as actions further west would result in more and more prisoners that would also be on their way to Egypt, and they would stop off on Tobruk on their way east. It will be those actions that will be the topic for next episode, as the British forces move towards what would be their final destination for Operation Compass, Beda Fomm.